with any information about what's going on in John the Baptist's house. It's just one of his lists of names of women who are following Jesus. He is not trying to make this point. Luke, nowhere in Luke or anywhere in the New Testament does it say, oh, they knew what was going on there because of this. And I don't think anyone even noticed this, probably until more than 1,000 years later, that you have this piece of information to explain that. Luke and Matthew and Mark are all sitting together and they're conspiring and say, well, how are we going to trick these historians into thinking all this is real? I don't find that a very credible idea. I'm not buying that, not even on a double coupon day. So, let's see. Undesigned basically means unplanned. You see a couple others. Mark 14:58. The accusers of Jesus' trial say, Jesus, we heard you're going to tear down the temple and rebuild it again. And in Mark 15:29, they say the same thing. But they don't tell us where these accusers got that idea. Is Jesus going around saying these things, that he's going to destroy the temple? Well, in John 2:18 through 21, we have a completely different account. I mean, this is in the beginning of John's Gospel, a long time before the crucifixion. And John has the Pharisees coming to Jesus to say, what miracle will you do to show us why you've done this? And Jesus answers them, destroy this temple and in 3 days I'll rebuild it. And that's not connected to that, but I mean, you put the pieces together, you get a bigger story out of it. This is expected if the writings are historical and real. It's not expected if people are making things up. Because if they're making things up, John's going to connect these two together and say, oh, that's how it happened. But he's not even trying to do that. It's like he doesn't even realize there's a problem. He's just saying what he saw and remembers. We also have one in the book of Acts where Paul is in Corinth and he says, hey, after Timothy and Silas got here, I started working full time. Well, why wasn't he fully devoted to his work before then? He doesn't say. But in 2 Corinthians, Paul told the Corinthians he didn't burden them, and that the brothers who came from Macedonia provided for his needs. So you can put two and two together in that before Timothy and Silas arrived, Paul actually had to work to support himself, even though neither of these sources tell us that. Point 8. Next slide. So, usually if you have people starting out as skeptical and they change their minds, then it usually takes something pretty good to convince them. I mean, you can find other situations, but this is a cumulative case here. You have this together with everything else, and all of a sudden, the side of our scale that weighs toward, hey, this is true, is going down and down and down. A couple examples of this. James, the brother of Jesus, was a skeptic during Jesus' life. I've got a couple examples here. Jesus' brothers didn't believe him. But then, after the resurrection, in Matthew 28:10, Jesus says, go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee and they will see me there. And then all of a sudden, we go to Acts chapter 1. Again, a different author still. And we see the apostles all joined together constantly in prayer, along with the women, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with his brothers. And then, after that, James went on to lead the Jerusalem church, and he was killed by the high priest Zenas because they didn't like the work he was doing as a Christian. The Jews were against him. So nowhere in the New Testament does it tell us that James had this transformative experience. We just see all these little bits and pieces we can piece together. And if James didn't believe Jesus while he was alive, and then Jesus died and did not rise from the dead, how did James change his mind? It becomes really difficult. Most people aren't going to change their mind at that point. Of course, we have Paul also. We know Paul says, I persecuted the way to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women. As the high priest and the whole council of elders can bear me witness. Paul was well educated. He studied under Gamaliel, who was a well-known Pharisaic teacher. He's giving up his position of authority. He gets beat and bruised, and all these bad things happen to him. Well, Paul's on his way to kill Christians. How does he change his mind unless he actually saw Jesus the way he described it? It just seems difficult. We don't have any good record of the New Testament writers having a motive for why they would want to fabricate it. In crimes, I think they're just about, go on to the next slide. Yeah, in crimes we see usually three common motives. Gain of riches, gain of women, gain of power. You know, you're in a gang and Joey, whoever is bad-mouthing about you, you shoot him up, you get arrested. Well, you don't like that he was taking away from your power by, giving you these insults. Or, you might, steal money to become more rich, which is very common. And, no one ever does anything bad to get women, right? I know no politicians would ever do any of these things, right? Okay, Muhammad and Joseph Smith actually used religion to gain all three of these. Both of them had multiple wives. At one point, Muhammad had four wives, which he had previously said was the limit, and then he said he received a special command from God saying now God gives him permission to have more than four wives. Very, very convenient. So, next slide, yeah. The best records we have show the apostles were frequently persecuted and killed. Acts 5:40, they called the apostles, beat them, ordered them not to speak about the one named Jesus, and then they let them go. You find lots and lots of passages like this in the New Testament where the Christians were just generally having a very hard time from the leaders persecuting them. And we know the story of Stephen. Stephen wasn't so lucky later on because he was actually killed. Tacitus was a Roman senator and historian. He was writing around the year 112 AD, but he was writing about Nero, who was emperor in the 60s. And he said, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for the abominations called the Christians by the populace. Christus, which most historians will say, yes, that's Christ, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hand of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. Accordingly, an arrest was made of all who pled guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted. Okay, so this is 30 years after the crucifixion. We're in Rome, which is a good distance, especially if you're walking around from Jerusalem, and you already have an immense multitude of Christians there. This thing was growing fast. And not only that, they're admitting their guilt and facing very, very bad things because they did that. This isn't, if you're trying to make this up to, get rich and powerful or women, you're really doing it the wrong way. You need to rethink what you're doing. Lack of motive. Let's see. Just another one. Pliny the Younger. He was also writing around the year 112, and he's talking about his procedure with the Christians. He catches them, and he says what he's going to do to them. And if they give up their belief, he's going to let them go. If they continue in it, then he orders them executed. Not a fun time. So, going to the next slide. The Shroud of Turin. This has been a recent research project for me. If you don't know about the Shroud of Turin, it is the alleged burial cloth of Christ, and it's actually the most thoroughly studied artifact in the world. It's a 14-foot by 3.5-foot linen cloth. It would have been, when Christ was, wow, that's loud. When Christ was buried, it would have been taken from the bottom of his feet, wrapped over his head, and then around the backside, and then he would have been bound with other additional linens to hold it in place, because the gospel writers talk about multiple linens, and also a cloth over his face. I'm not sure exactly how all that came together, but this would be the main cloth. It has the image of a crucified man of Jewish appearance on it. We actually still own this today. It's in Turin, Italy. That's where it gets its name. And the image is flash burned into the cloth. It's not a painting, it's not a dye, it's not a powder, it's not a chalk. There are no brush strokes, but just, you have linen, you have fibers that make up each thread of linen, and it's just the top outer part of each fiber that is burned. And the only way anyone's been able to reproduce this is with a very high-powered laser, very high amount of energy for a very short nanoseconds amount of time in order to create this type of burning in a cloth. They had lasers in the 1st century, right, Mitchell? Don't think so, okay. It has blood from wounds that match Jesus' crucifixion. There's a lot of pinpricks around the head, actually all over the top of the head, because they think the crown of thorns would have been a cap. There's a nail to the side with a watery fluid staining in the cloth. Holes in the wrists. In the Greek, the word, the New Testament says Jesus was pierced through his hand, but in the Greek, the word for hand, it can actually be all the way down to about here. And believe it or not, there's been experiments with cadavers, and if you want someone to stay on the cross, you got to put it through the wrist. I won't go into too much detail on that. There's hundreds of scourge marks on the back. The scourge marks each have a tiny barbell, which matches what we found in Roman flagrum. The wound on the side actually matches the shape of one of the few different types of spears that Roman soldiers would have carried. You have chafe marks along the back, which would match someone carrying the crossbeam of their cross. You have nashes on the knees. Someone is carrying the beam when they fell down. I don't have it zoomed in so you can see these details. Let's see, it's blood type AB, which was common among people in the Middle East, but less common elsewhere. And the blood on the cross has high amounts of bilirubin, creatine, and ferritin, which are things that happen when you're under extreme, very, very bad stress. If someone's just taking this cloth and painting blood on it with a paintbrush, they're not going to know to put all that on there to fool people in the future, because nobody in past times knew about those things. A lot of these details are only visible with a microscope or under ultraviolet light. We've had all those in the 1st century, right? Probably not. It has pollen on it from plants, the type of pollen you would expect to see in Jerusalem in springtime. And it has other pollen too, because it was transported over the years to Turin, Italy. But whenever the fiber was first made, they'd be laid out to dry while it was still wet. That's when it's going to absorb the most pollen. So you see mostly pollen on it from what you would find in Jerusalem in springtime. Jesus was crucified in the spring. Wake up, computer. There it goes. Okay. On the cloth, we find limestone powder on it. Limestone is one of those things where, depending on where in the world the limestone is, it has other impurities mixed in with it, various other minerals. This particular type of limestone is called, I didn't write it down, something aragonite. I don't remember. But it's the same type of limestone that the cliff where the Holy Sepulchre, if I'm pronouncing that right, and the Garden Tomb are at. And these are two sites that we think might be the tomb where Christ was buried in Jerusalem today. Next slide. So we got some counter-arguments here. First of all, in 1988, a corner was taken off of the shroud. It was cut into 3 pieces and sent to laboratories at Oxford, Zurich, and the University of Arizona. Each one carbon dated it, and they all got carbon dates of around 1260 to 1390 AD. And around the same time, we have a bishop who drafted a letter to the Pope. He never actually sent this letter before he died, but the letter said he knew a priest who knew the person who painted the shroud. And this was actually around both of these dates, around the 1300s, was whenever the shroud, we have a chain of custody of, we know exactly where the shroud was going back to about the 1300s. Between the 1300s and the 1200s, we're not quite sure where it was. We think the Knights Templar may have had it. And then early in history before that, we have various references of a cloth with the image of Jesus on it. At one point, there was actually even a battle fought over the cloth. It was in the Muslim-controlled city of Edessa, and I think it was the Romans who came, and they actually fought a battle just to get the shroud. But, okay, so what do we do with this carbon date and this other information? In more recent years, it's come to light that the corner where they took the sample looks like it may have been repaired, or if it wasn't repaired, it at least had a lot of contamination in it. I'm not going to go into exactly how carbon dating works. That's another talk. But if you have organic material, there's added, much more recently in history, you're carbon dating that material instead of the actual cloth. So some of the tests done on this corner since that time, they've found wax, starch, plant gum, and various other coatings on top of the threads. There's 20 times more aluminum in that particular corner, which means something's being added to it. There's actually cotton fibers woven into that corner. It's about twice as heavy as the other parts of the shroud. And there's disagreement. Some experts actually say, linen weaving experts, that's a thing. They see that, they look at photographs of this and they say, hey, I can see where there's a reweave here. Others disagree. I haven't actually gone through all the back and forth with that one, but I think there's more than enough evidence to show that whatever's going on with that corner, it's not a representation of the rest of the cloth. And as I said, there's no brush marks or paint or dyes or gums or chalk or whatever that creates the image on the shroud. So this bishop who wrote this letter, that doesn't, I mean, it's kind of like third-hand testimony. He never sent the letter to the Pope. He was in a position where his own cathedral was receiving less attention and less tourism because everyone was going to see the shroud. You have a possible motive there. And we might not know what exactly happened there, but in my mind, I think the evidence of the shroud's authenticity outweighs these other arguments. I think we've got enough to go on here. Also, we've done linen dating on the shroud. That's basically, if you have linen, over time it gradually becomes more and more brittle. So they'll take a thread of linen and gradually add more and more pressure on it until it breaks. And the idea is if you measure the width, then you can tell about how old the linen is because, well, the older it gets, the more fragile it is. And the linen dating puts it around 33 BC plus or minus 250 years because you're not going to get a lot of accuracy just by seeing how strong the linen is. But that's incompatible also with it being created forged in the Middle Ages. If you go online, there's lots of theories about how the shroud is made, how it could have been forged. I'm not going to go through all of those. I've actually watched, in addition to a book and a lot of articles I read about this, I've seen a 4-hour talk just on the Shroud of Turin, and they didn't cover all of the material. Like I said, it's the most studied artifact in the world. There's hundreds of papers published on it. Even skeptics changed. I know at one point, Ray Rogers, he was the head chemist in the Shroud of Turin research project. They were the ones who examined the shroud in the 70s when they did the first large amount of scientific testing on it. And he actually died as an atheist. And he was a skeptic. He said, I don't believe in miracles, no way. And whenever people first started presenting this evidence saying, hey, we think this corner of the shroud's contaminated, he set out to disprove it. He's like, well, we know it's a medieval forgery. And in 2005, he wrote a paper, published it in a well-known chemistry journal, that, hey, they're right, this actually isn't part of the shroud. So he died not knowing how the image was created. He wouldn't accept that, hey, it's real, but, you know, he changed his mind at least about, you know, that it's a medieval forgery. Okay, so that's the 10 points. There's a lot of other things I could have talked about. I'm just trying to give you guys an overview of various types of evidence. I could have gone into a lot of archaeological corroborations of what we see in the New Testament. Gone through some things that secular historians have written about the darkness and the earthquake and the crucifixion. There's a few different things you can go through in arguments for prophecy. But like I said, I'm just trying to give you guys an introduction. Most of these points you could write a book about, and several books have been written about. Very, very deep. Lots of information. Next slide. Finally, if you want to learn some more, these are some good sources. I especially like the book in the middle, Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace. Wallace is the detective who has been on Dateline NBC more than any other detective. I know at one point in his career that once he had taken his evidence to court, he had never lost a case. I don't know if that's still true. I know at that point he'd been a detective. It may still be true. He'd been a detective for a few decades. And he grew up an atheist. When he was 35, he took his detective skills, he looked at the Gospels, he use the same criteria that he used to evaluate all other types of witness testimony, and he came to the conclusion that, yeah, this is real history, and he wrote a book about it. And he might still be a detective, I'm not sure. I know he's also a pastor. Very interesting story, very articulate guy, much better speaker than I am. He was actually down in Louisville yesterday at a conference, and I got to watch him speak, and I'm like, I got a lot to learn. On the left here, we have a book about the Shroud of Turin. It's about 450 pages, goes into a lot of detail. That author of that book argues that it was actually radiation from the resurrection that threw off the carbon date, and that the coroner wasn't repaired. I disagree with him on that part. I think the evidence goes the other way. Maybe there was also radiation at the resurrection. I don't know. I don't think there's any way you can prove or disprove that. The case of the resurrection of Jesus, written by 2 New Testament historians. And one guy I also like is Tim McGrew, and also his wife Lydia McGrew. Lydia actually has a book out now. Tim, I don't think has any books, but he has a lot of talks on YouTube. He's been on a few podcasts. Very interesting to listen to. You can get into a lot more depth on many of the things I talked about. I know he has like an hour and a half interview just about the book of Acts and how it corresponds to other things in history, which I spent like 1 or 2 slides on. Or that might be his wife Lydia, I can't remember. They both do the same thing. They both do really good work. So that concludes the useful part of my presentation. You guys have any questions? I love questions. The hard part is the answers. So if you just want questions and no answers, that's fine. I'm kidding. I've done a lot of talking. Hopefully you all are still awake. Anything you want? If I don't know, I'll tell you I don't know.
Don't be shy. I'll go ahead and start. So with the shroud, it's awesome. It's the most studied
Artifact in the world.
Yeah, I've never studied it. It's great.
It's the Catholics have it. I think a lot of Protestants don't pay much attention to it because it's a Catholic thing, and there's a lot of fake Catholic relics, and that probably turns people off. If you go to Wikipedia and you read about it, they will say the carbon-14 dating disproves the shroud. They won't go into all of the evidence to the contrary. It comes up in the news a lot. They'll say some discovery, it proves the shroud is real, and the next discovery proves the shroud is fake. Most of these articles aren't very good. A lot of them have outdated information, and this wasn't something I realized in the past few months when I started doing a deep dive into the shroud. One thing about making the case for the accuracy of the Bible to someone who's skeptical is, you have lots and lots of little arguments. And if you present if you have 3 minutes, you present just a few of them and say, well, that's just not enough evidence. And admittedly, I agree with that. But when you have a very large amount of little arguments, they add up. And that's harder to fake than one big argument. And the shroud might be one big argument. I'm becoming more and more convinced of that the more I study it. And we'll see where that goes. I might actually someday put together the whole presentation just on the shroud. Any other questions?
Of those 10 points, what do you say is the strongest ones you personally feel are?
I'm starting to think the shroud, but it's still a journey for me. It's one of the harder ones to make because it has a lot of technical details to it. You kind of have to get into, how, people are going to want to know how carbon dating works, how much contamination you need numbers in there. So, like I said, I wish there were more just one-off easy points. But, one single point is so a lot easier to fake than lots and lots and lots of small points. So in the end, I think we're better off this way. You got to have a relationship with people. You got to spend time with them. You got to go through it. And they got to be interested. They got to be interested enough to at least hear you out and open-minded. Any other questions? That's a really good question. Yeah.
I'm more of a statement. My oldest daughter wasn't able to be here tonight, but she said before we left that hearing you speak was one of the most influential speeches that she'd ever heard in regards to her faith.
Okay, she needs to get on YouTube.
Have you ever considered writing a book yourself?
I'm starting a website, where I just put various articles I write for free. It's not public yet, because I want to at least get enough out there that it's not just like a 1 or 2 or 3 article website. That'll come eventually. It's I'll go and tell you what it is now. It's actually online. I just don't advertise it. Bereanarchive.org. It's Berean, and then archive.org. If you remember the book of Acts, the Bereans were the ones who double-checked what Paul told them, and that's what I try to do with everything I hear. If I hear another Christian apologist tell me something, even if there's someone that I have a great amount of respect and trust for, I always try to at least go to the other side and see, if there's something they missed. Like in Mike Lacona's book, he mentioned one of his arguments is there's more historical sources for Jesus than any other person from antiquity. And one of the skeptics actually put forward a very detailed blog showing that there were more sources for Tiberius Caesar for Jesus. And Lacona came back and admitted and said, well, I didn't realize all this. So, Lacona, I have great respect for Lacona. We all make mistakes. Hopefully I haven't made any tonight. But like I said, I hope all of you also go and double check everything that I've said. And, in many cases, I've done this with so many things where I'll see one piece of information, I'm like, wow, that's amazing. And then I'll read the other side, I'm like, wow, they're really tricking me. And then I'll read further and I'm like, wow, that wasn't right either. And it just takes time, you got to go through it. But thank you so much for sharing that. I know J. Warner Wallace has a few talks on YouTube. If your daughter thinks that I'm influential, then she's going to get more out of him than she is me. But thank you. Any other questions?
You Case for Christ, was that a big part of your life?
Trouble? It was. And if it weren't for J. Warner Wallace's book, I would have that up here. But J. Warner Wallace covers a lot of the same topics, and he does it just a little bit better. I have great respect for Lee Strobel. I thought he wrote a great book. It was the first Christian book that I read, and it led me to being a Christian. And that movie, if you guys haven't seen his movie, they actually got an actor to play him, so he doesn't have the strange Wisconsin accent, thankfully. But it's a very good movie about his life story and his own conversion. The Case for Christ. One of, people kind of make fun of Christian movies sometimes, and this is one of the Christian movies that is actually really, really good. Anyone else? All right, I'll be hanging around here if you want to talk to me, or if you want to teach me something, if you want to tell me what I did wrong, I will listen. All right, thank you so much, everyone.